The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and Brooke Sullivan moved through Oak Creek Memorial Supply Corridor at 4:13 a.m. with the kind of precision that made inefficiency visible. Her hands didn't hesitate. Saline bags lined the cart in descending size order. Gore stacks formed perfect rectangles. Trauma tape aligned edge to edge on the lower shelf. 20 years. That's how long she'd been doing this exact choreography before anyone else arrived, before the chaos began, before the first code blue of the day scattered people like startled birds. She wore the same faded navy scrub she'd owned for 6 years, the hem unraveling slightly at the left ankle where her boot would catch it during 12-hour shifts. The boots themselves, genuine military issue, leather cracked from desert environments that scorched above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sat hidden in locker 347, wedged behind her thermos and a lunch bag containing a sandwich she'd stopped eating. The boots had blood in them. Not visible blood. The kind that seeped into leather and stayed there, a permanent stain beneath the surface that soap and water couldn't touch. Brooke's fingers moved like someone playing an instrument they'd mastered decades ago. Left hand. Right hand. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The kind of efficiency that only came from having done the same task under conditions where mistakes meant casualties instead of inconvenience. A small scar on her left forearm caught the light as she worked, pale white tissue running 3 inches down toward her wrist. She never talked about it. Nobody asked. Room for 12 was 3 corridors east, past the ICU where machines beeped in a rhythm that sounded like Morse code spelling out mortality statistics. Brooke pushed the supply cart with one hand, her movement silent on the linoleum. At 4:52 a.m., Oak Creek Memorial belonged to the night shift, skeleton crew, skeleton noise, the kind of quiet that let you hear your own heartbeat if you listened hard enough. She didn't listen. She counted, instead. Surgical sutures. EKG leads. Drainage tubes. The mathematical world was safer than the emotional one. Staff Sergeant Chen lay in the hospital bed with his left leg elevated, shrapnel removal surgery scheduled for 7 a.m., and something in his eyes that made Brooke pause at the doorway. Not pain. Pain was information. Pain was data. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they've seen before but can't quite place in their memory. His eyes were dark brown, sharp with military discipline, and they tracked her movements as she entered to check his vitals. "Morning, Sergeant," she said quietly, keeping the voice professional and thin as paper. "How's the pain level?" 5 out of 10. Could be worse. He didn't look away from her face. "You were at Kandahar, weren't you?" Brooke's hands didn't flinch. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. She reached for his full line, checking the saline drip with the focused attention of someone who hadn't just heard a question that should have been impossible. "I don't know what you mean." "You've got a scar on your neck," Chen said, eye still tracking hers. "Right beneath the left ear. Same place I've got one. You get that from a sniper round in 2009. She adjusted his blanket with methodical care, tucking it along the edges of the mattress. The motion was a wall. The wall was necessary. "I think your pre-op medications are making you talkative, Sergeant. Try to get some sleep." She left before he could speak again, pushing the cart with movements that remained steady and unremarkable. Her heart wasn't steady. Her heart was doing something that felt like running, like sprinting through compound walls at midnight, like being 23 years old and understanding that the boy she'd just pulled from the rubble would grow up thinking she was just a nurse who worked in some American hospital. The morning routine continued uninterrupted. Chart checks. Medication reconciliation. The kitchen staff arrived at 5:15 a.m. smelling like the industrial coffee they'd been brewing since before sunrise. The ICU nurse, Patricia, called down at 5:40 with routine updates. By 6:27 a.m., the world of Oak Creek Memorial began to wake up, and the quiet morning transformed into the controlled chaos of a medical institution preparing for a new day. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 6:19 a.m. The chief of surgery had been appointed 3 months ago, imported from Johns Hopkins with credentials that preceded him like a smell. 54 years old. Expensive watch, the Rolex Submariner, running about $12,000 before the bezel came loose. Custom shoes with leather so soft they made barely any sound against the hallway tiles. His presence occupied space the way certain people's presence does, not through volume but through the understanding that they expected deference before they'd even opened their mouths. He had the kind of face that years of being right had carved into something hard, with a jawline that looked like it had been designed to deliver criticism without guilt. He surveyed the nurse's station at morning rounds with the expression of a man who'd just noticed the building was slightly off-kilter. His gaze landed on Brooke, who was transcribing medication orders onto the day's charts with steady handwriting, and something moved across his face, recognition without acknowledgement, like spotting an error in calculations that he'd fix later with a pen stroke. "Good morning, everyone," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the cultivated tone of someone who'd learned that volume was unnecessary when authority was understood. "I trust we're all ready for a productive day." Brooke continued writing. The morning rounds would begin in pediatrics, move through medical surgical, and arrive at trauma and post-op by 7:30. She'd reviewed the charts already. 3 post-op patients. 2 admissions overnight. 1 medication order that she'd flagged for verification because the decimal point was positioned incorrectly and decimal points killed people. Rounds began at 7:15 a.m., moving room to room with the surgical team trailing behind Hargrove like he was some kind of authority magnet. Resident. 2 medical students. 1 nursing supervisor. Brooke followed at the periphery, the way she always did, her role understood without explanation, watching, observing, catching what other people missed. She'd caught medication errors before. 4 times in 20 years. Each time, she'd stepped forward quietly and pointed out the mistake. Room for 18 was post-op from emergency appendectomy, patient stable, no complications, ready for discharge in 24 hours. Room for 19 held an 82-year-old woman recovering from a hip replacement, pain managed, physical therapy scheduled. Room for 21 was the problematic one. The patient was 59 years old, recovering from gallbladder surgery, and Hargrove was about to prescribe something that would interact with his existing heart medications in a way that would kill him within 72 hours. Metoclopramide for nausea, Hargrove stated, writing the order on the chart. 10 milligrams for every 6 hours. Brooke stepped forward. The movement was quiet, unobtrusive, the kind of step that preceded information rather than challenge. "Doctor, the patient is on sotalol for his arrhythmia. The metoclopramide prolongs the QT interval. Combined, there's a 78% risk of torsades de pointes." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent patient's room. Quiet like a held breath. Quiet like a switch flipped somewhere deep in the machinery of how power worked. Hargrove looked up from the chart with the expression of a man who'd just been corrected by someone beneath his notice. His eyes moved across Brooke's face like she was a problem he hadn't scheduled time for. "Thank you for the observation, nurse. I'm familiar with medication interactions. The combination creates a life-threatening arrhythmia," Brooke said quietly, keeping the voice steady and professional. She was right. The numbers were correct. The evidence was in every medical database that existed. A different antiemetic would be safer. Ondansetron, perhaps. It doesn't interact with sotalol. One of the medical students shifted his weight. The resident looked at his shoes. Hargrove's jaw tightened, and then he smiled, a smile like a predator showing teeth before the strike. He crossed out his original order and wrote ondansetron for milligrams for Q6H in handwriting that looked like controlled fury. "Clearly I underestimated the scope of your responsibilities," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. He left the room before anyone else could speak. The rounds continued, room for 22, room for 23, and the surgical team shuffled along behind him, the medical students avoiding eye contact with Brooke as they passed her in the doorway. The resident didn't avoid eye contact. The resident looked at her like she'd just volunteered to run into traffic. By 8:51 a.m., the interaction was already a story. Hospital gossip moved faster than email, faster than official documentation, faster than anyone could acknowledge. By 10:08 a.m., it had reached the staff lounge. The staff lounge smelled like industrial coffee and the exhaustion of people who'd been awake for too many hours. Brooke was eating her lunch, a tuna sandwich and an apple, when Hargrove walked in and sat down directly across from her, the movement theatrical and deliberate. He had an audience. 3 nurses at the coffee station. 2 residents reviewing charts near the window. Everyone stopped what they were doing with the kind of subtle pause that meant they'd been waiting for something entertaining to happen. "You know what I find fascinating?" Hargrove said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. 20 years of nursing, and suddenly you're correcting surgeons. That's quite an arc. He leaned back in his chair like he'd paid for everyone's attention with his presence alone. "Tell you what. I'm going to make a prediction." He paused, letting the silence build like a conductor before the crescendo. "I predict that within 7 days, you'll hand in your resignation. You'll realize that this job requires knowing your place, and your place isn't correcting the chief of surgery in front of residents." Brooke continued eating her sandwich. She chewed. She swallowed. The apple was crisp and cold, and she bit into it with teeth that didn't shake. Her hands weren't on the table. Her hands were in her lap, perfectly still, the kind of still that came from training instead of fear. "I'll give you odds," Hargrove continued, now playing to his audience. 3-1 says you'll quit within a week. Anybody want to take that bet? The room didn't answer. The room was waiting to see if Brooke would say something, cry something, defend something. She didn't. She finished her sandwich. She stood up with her apple and her empty lunch bag and her composure like a shield made of reinforced steel. She walked past him to the trash can. "That's what I thought," Hargrove said, his voice following her like a weapon. "Just a nurse playing surgeon." Brooke deposited her lunch bag in the trash. She turned toward the door. She didn't look back at him, didn't acknowledge the comment, didn't give him the satisfaction of visible reaction. She walked out into the corridor where machines hummed and people moved with purpose, and the morning light from the eastern windows made everything look like it was made of glass. What she didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. What Hargrove didn't know was that he'd just made a miscalculation so fundamental that it would eventually cost him everything. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and yesterday's gravy when Hargrove made his move. Brooke carried her tray past his table, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, a banana she'd been eating for 3 days straight because it was the only thing her stomach would accept anymore. His elbow came up like a mechanical gate, precise and deliberate. Not accidental. Never accidental. The tray flipped. Eggs scattered across the tile in a yellow arc, coffee splashed up her scrubs, a brown stain spreading across her chest like a wound. The banana rolled under a table. 20 staff members stopped mid-conversation. The room went dead silent except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the faint beep of the distant code blue monitor. Hargrove didn't look up from his phone. "Clumsy today, aren't we?" Brooke felt the heat rise to her face, felt the burn behind her eyes, felt the ancient weight of 1,000 small humiliations pressing down on her shoulders. She knelt without a word. Collected each piece of egg with a paper napkin, one by one. Picked up the tray. Wiped her hands. Her left hand trembled, just barely, just enough that only someone trained to read the smallest signs of stress would notice it. Someone like Staff Sergeant Chen, who sat 3 tables away in a hospital gown and 4-pole, watching with the exact focus of a man who recognized something he'd seen before. She walked to the kitchen. Disposed of the mess. Cleaned her scrubs with paper towels, working water into the coffee stain. When she returned to the line, her composure was absolute. Not anger. Not hurt. Nothing at all. That was always the trick, to be so thoroughly emptied of reaction that there was nothing left for him to break. "I'm going on break," she said quietly to the cafeteria attendant, who'd watched the entire thing with the pained expression of someone who'd seen this performance before. The attendant didn't respond. Just nodded. That afternoon, during rounds, Hargrove announced it like it was a hospital policy. "I'm calling it now. Little Miss Marta quits within a week. She doesn't have the spine for real hospital work." He wrote it on the whiteboard in the staff lounge, letters huge, and read, "Sullivan exit pool, 7 days." Someone had already started taking bets. 2 residents put in $20 each. A cardiac nurse added her name to the pot. $23 and climbing. Brooke pretended not to see it as she walked past the lounge to check on her patients. The betting pool was a signal, not just Hargrove's opinion anymore, but institutional prediction. When people started betting on your failure, the failure felt inevitable. The house always wins. The third humiliation came during evening rounds. Brooke was checking Chen's vitals, noting the subtle irregularity in his heart rhythm that the monitors weren't catching yet, something about his recovery that didn't feel right, that pulled at her instincts like a rope attached to something deep. Hargrove swept in with the residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. He glanced at Chen's chart, then threw it at Brooke's feet. Paper scattered across the floor like snow. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, smirking. "Since you're so eager to do everyone else's job." Chen's monitor spiked. Heart rate jumped to 118. His hand gripped the bed rail hard enough to go white. Brooke took one measured breath. She felt the tears come, just one escaping down her cheek before her body remembered the training, before her nervous system switched into the mode it had learned in places where crying meant death. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice came out cold, flat, edged like sharpened steel. "I've carried heavier things than your ego, doctor." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next room wheeze its mechanical rhythm. The residents stared at their shoes. Chen watched her with an expression that flickered between pride and something else, recognition, maybe. Or grief. Hargrove smiled. He'd found his target. She'd given him exactly what he needed, proof that she had vulnerability, that she could be wounded. In his mind, that meant she could be broken. Over the next 48 hours, he activated his network with the precision of a man conducting a symphony. He called board member Patricia Owens during her morning tennis game, voice smooth as oil. "We have a liability issue. A nurse overstepping her scope, creating legal exposure. I wanted you to hear it from me first." He contacted Brooke's nursing school in Atlanta, spoke to the registrar personally, tone concerned and professional. "I need any incident reports, disciplinary actions, anything that flagged during her training. This is a credentialing matter." He brought in an external investigator, fed him carefully framed concerns like breadcrumbs, suspicious competence beyond her training level. Possible credential fraud. "We need a full audit." The walls closed in like a vice. Brooke's schedule changed daily. She was reassigned to different floors without notice. Her access code stopped working for certain medication dispensaries. She found herself locked out of the system that had been her world for 20 years. The hospital administrator, a woman named Keene who'd always nodded at her in the hallways, called her into her office on the second day. The tone wasn't friendly anymore. It was interrogative, suspicious, the voice of someone reading from a script that had already been written by people higher up the chain. "Brooke, we're doing a routine credentialing review. Need to clarify some things from your employment history. There appear to be some gaps." Brooke sat across from her, spine straight, hands folded. "What kind of gaps?" "Years where you worked independently. No institutional affiliation on file. We need verification of those positions, references, background documentation. This is standard procedure." It wasn't standard procedure. Brooke had worked at Oak Creek for 20 years. They'd done her credentialing when she was hired. Nobody reviewed the past unless they were building a case. She understood exactly what was happening. She was being boxed in, systematically, by someone who'd done this before. That night, when Ethan came home from school, he found her in the kitchen staring at an old photograph album. The images inside were faded, Brooke in dress blues, a man beside her with a sealed trident pin catching the light, both of them younger and whole and living in a world that didn't exist anymore. The man was Marcus. Her husband. Her cover. The person who'd loved her not despite what she was, but because of it. "Mom, what's happening at work?" Ethan's voice was careful, the voice of a kid who'd learned to read tension the way other kids read comic books. She closed the album. "Nothing I can't handle, baby." But her hand shook as she said it, and Ethan was smart enough not to ask again. Meanwhile, Chen's recovery was starting to deviate in subtle ways. His vitals showed instability that the monitors weren't flagging yet, a slight irregularity in his sinus rhythm, a diastolic pressure that kept trending lower, the kind of thing that made Brooke's nervous system light up like a control panel. Something was building inside him. Something the residents were missing. She increased his monitoring frequency. Stayed late checking his charts. Left detailed notes about the pattern she was seeing, the small wobble in his recovery trajectory that suggested cardiac complications developing. Someone kept removing those notes from his file. She requested to remain on Chen's care team. The assignment office denied it. She asked why. No explanation. Just a reassignment to the obstetrics wing, a floor she'd never worked, patients she didn't know, systems she'd have to learn from scratch while Hargrove tightened the noose. She understood what was happening. She was being cut off. Systematically separated from the one patient in this hospital whose crisis would matter, the one person who seemed to recognize something in her that nobody else could see. And whatever was building inside James Chen, she wouldn't be there to stop it. The rain started that evening, hammering the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. Brooke sat in her car for 40 minutes before driving home, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. The monitor screamed at 2:36 a.m. Beep! 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 Then the alarm, that ascending wail that means a heart is failing. Room for 12. The cardiac unit's recovery wing, 3 floors above the emergency department where Brooke stood restocking crash carts at the nursing station, her hands moving on muscle memory while her mind did what it always did at this hour, counted the quiet. The intercom crackled. Code blue, room for 12. Attending to cardiac, stat. Brooke's hands froze. The 14-gauge needle she'd been holding clattered to the metal tray. Room for 12. Staff Sergeant James Chen. The man whose eyes had locked on hers in the hallway 2 days ago with a look she'd spent 48 hours trying not to analyze. The man she'd been assigned to keep at arm's length, whose chart she reviewed 3 times daily, whose oxygen saturation she'd checked at midnight, at 2 a.m., knowing that his recovery was proceeding exactly as it should. Until it wasn't. She didn't run. Not yet. Running would draw attention. Running would require explanation. Brooke Sullivan, night shift nurse, had no reason to abandon her post for the cardiac floor. But she moved, that strange economy of motion that looked casual to anyone watching but covered 30 meters in 12 seconds, through the swinging doors, into the stairwell, up 3 flights with her hand on the metal rail like it was aircraft rigging and her boots hitting each step with the precision of someone who'd climbed similar stairs in darkness with 30 pounds of body armor and a soldier dying in her arms. The cardiac unit door was propped open. She could hear the resident's voice, high, panicked, words tumbling over each other. "I don't know, I think we should wait for Dr. Morrison, I'm not certified for this, we need the procedure kit from downstairs." She stepped into room for 12 and the world contracted to a single, terrible clarity. Chen was conscious, his face the color of wet concrete, his oxygen mask fogging in irregular patterns. His mouth was open like a fish pulled from water. The ventilator was still running but it sounded wrong, shallow, struggling, like the machine was trying to breathe for a body that wasn't responding. The monitor showed tachycardia, the numbers climbing, 128, 132, 141. His blood pressure had collapsed to 60/35. The young resident, a woman whose name badge read Dr. Patrice Kumar, PGY-1, stood frozen at the bedside, her hands trembling, her eyes darting between the monitor and the door like she was waiting for someone older to arrive and tell her what to do. Brooke knew what to do. Attending, she asked, not moving, assessing. 2 minutes out, Dr. Kumar whispered. Maybe 3. He was recovering fine, his vitals were stable, and then the monitor just. But Brooke was already moving. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, compressing it, suffocating it. The clinical word for dying slowly while your own body betrayed you. Chen had 6 minutes before his brain started dying. 10 minutes before his heart stopped for the last time. She grabbed the spinal needle from the crash cart, 18 gauge, clean, perfect. Her left hand found his ribs, counting downward with fingers that remembered this exact motion, this exact angle, taught to her in a FOB in Helmand province by a Navy surgeon who'd said, when you're 30 miles from a hospital and a guy's lungs are filling with blood, this is how you buy him for hours. Her right hand felt for the subcostal angle, that narrow space below the 5th rib where a needle could slip through soft tissue without hitting bone. "What are you doing?" Dr. Kumar's voice cracked. "We're not authorized." Brooke didn't answer. Authorization was a luxury for people with time. She found the landmarks with her fingers the way a musician finds a chord, the way a gunsmith strips a rifle in the dark. The needle went in at 60 degrees, angled toward the shoulder blade, and when it breached the pericardium, the resistance released like a sigh. Blood filled the syringe. Dark, venous, life-stealing. The moment the pressure released, Chen's body seized forward in the bed, that terrible convulsion of air rushing back into lungs, of pressure releasing from a heart that had been suffocating inside its own membrane. His mouth opened. A sound came out that was half gasp, half sobbing. The monitor changed. The pressure released. O2 climbing, 74. 79, 84. His heart rhythm steadied on the screen from the chaotic fluttering into something that resembled normal, something that resembled living. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, burst through the door at the 3:04 mark, running, already reaching for gloves, already assessing, and then stopping cold. His eyes went from the monitor to the syringe in Brooke's hand to Chen's stable vital signs to Dr. Kumar's face, which was white as hospital linens. "Where did you?" Dr. Morrison started, his voice moving toward something between accusation and disbelief. "How did you? That's not a standard." Brooke set the needle down with perfect care. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat. Her hands were steady. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric drone above her head, indifferent to what they'd just witnessed. She stepped back from the bed, from Dr. Morrison, from the attending who was still staring at the equipment setup like he was trying to reverse engineer a procedure he'd only read about in trauma journals. "He's stabilizing," Brooke said. Her voice was flat, informational, the voice of someone reporting the weather. "Pericardiocentesis. Cardiac tamponade. Pressures released." She didn't wait for the questions that were already forming behind Dr. Morrison's eyes. She didn't wait for Dr. Kumar to find her voice or for the attending to process how a night shift nurse had just performed an emergency procedure that most first-year residents spent their entire training learning to recognize. She walked out of room for 12 and closed the door quietly, and in that moment of quiet closure, she felt a pair of eyes lock onto hers from the hospital bed. Chen's eyes. Conscious. Aware. And in them, something shifted behind the oxygen mask, a recognition that moved through time like sonar through dark water, crossing 20 years in a single heartbeat. A woman's voice in the dark, carrying him through enemy fire in Marja, promising him he would live. The same steadiness in her hands. The same composure under fire. The same woman, older now, wearing scrubs instead of body armor, but moving with that identical economy of motion, that same precision, that same refusal to flinch. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask prevented it. The morphine would drag him under within seconds. But his lips formed a single word, barely a whisper against the medical equipment keeping him alive, Sullivan. Not a question. A recognition. A name that shouldn't have meant anything to a combat medic who'd spent 8 years trying to recover that singular moment of rescue, trying to find the woman who'd pulled him from a compound in Afghanistan when he was 8 years old and afraid, carrying him 3 miles through hell. Brooke kept walking. Down the corridor. Down the stairs. Back to the crash cart on the emergency department floor, where the needles needed restocking and the monitors needed checking and the night shift required the kind of person who showed up early and left late and asked no questions and expected no recognition. But her hands were trembling now, not from fear, not from adrenaline, but from the effort of restraint. From the terrible knowledge that the past, which had been buried so carefully, so professionally, under classified orders and sealed records, had just recognized her in the dark. The past had just spoken her name. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office at 6:11 a.m., coffee steaming on the mahogany desk, watching the security footage on loop. Brooke's hands moving with surgical precision. The needle sliding through skin. The hiss of air escaping the pericardium. The attending physician stepping back, shock written across his face. He rewound it 3 times, each viewing crystallizing his strategy like ice forming on winter glass. By 7:15 a.m., he was making calls. Patricia Owens answered on the 3rd ring. She was at the country club, tennis racket in hand, about to serve. Hargrove didn't waste pleasantries. "Patricia, we have a liability crisis at Oak Creek. The nurse I mentioned, Sullivan, she performed a surgical procedure without authorization. Cardiac intervention. We need the board to move immediately or we're exposed to federal compliance violations." Patricia's voice shifted. This was the language she understood. Financial exposure. Institutional risk. By 8:48 a.m., 3 board members had received his message in varying forms: phone calls, emails marked urgent, a breakfast meeting cancelled and rescheduled as an emergency session. At 8:33 a.m., Hargrove contacted Brooke's nursing school references: St. Augustine School of Nursing, 42 years old, accreditation hanging by a thread after a recent scandal. He spoke to the dean directly. "I'm conducting a personnel investigation into one of your graduates. Brooke Sullivan. Class of 2004. We're documenting incidents of operating outside scope of practice, possible credential fraud. We'll need incident reports, disciplinary records, anything you have that shows a pattern of boundary violations." The dean's voice trembled. We don't have anything like that in her file. She was exemplary." Hargrove's response was ice. "That's what we need documented. The absence of red flags when there should have been some. For our records." He hung up before the dean could protest. The investigator's name was Richard Vance. 38 years old, former hospital administrator who'd been pushed out of 3 institutions for aggressive compliance audits. Hargrove had used him before. Vance answered on the 2nd ring, already walking through the parking garage toward his sedan. "I need a full credentials audit on a nurse. Expedited. I'm prepared to pay double rate if you can have preliminary findings by end of business today." Vance's breathing changed, faster now, predatory. "What's the angle?" Hargrove smiled into the phone. "Suspicious competence. She performed an advanced procedure at 2:51 a.m. during a code. Saved the patient's life, which is the problem. If she has that level of skill, her education record should reflect advanced certifications. If it doesn't, she falsified credentials to access prohibited protocols. Either way, liability nightmare." Vance was already pulling up databases on his laptop. "I'm on it. I'll need access to her employment file, her original applications, references from every institution she's worked." "You'll have everything by 9:06 a.m., Hargrove said. "And Richard, be thorough. I want this airtight." By 9:38 a.m., Hargrove was in the hospital's legal department with external investigators and 3 members of the administrative team. He spread the surveillance footage across the conference room table like evidence at a crime scene. She performed a pericardiocentesis without attending physician authorization. That's a surgical intervention requiring specific credentialing. Our Nurse Practice Act is explicit: RNs cannot perform independent surgical procedures. She either has credentials she's hidden, or she's been practicing medicine without a license. The hospital's general counsel, a woman named Margaret Chen with 30 years of experience, leaned back, jaw tight. "We need to verify her actual credentials before we take action. If she has certifications that cover this, we have no case." Hargrove had anticipated this. "Which is exactly why we need an external audit. We can't be seen investigating our own staff. It creates liability either way." But if an independent investigator finds discrepancies, that protects us. If he finds nothing, we have documentation that we conducted due diligence. The logic was sound. Corrupt, but sound. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll contact Vance. We'll need his preliminary report within 48 hours. Brooke didn't know any of this when she arrived for her shift at 6:38 a.m. She went to room for 12 first, a habit now. Staff Sergeant Chen was awake, for lines running, monitor showing beautiful sinus rhythm at 78 beats per minute. His eyes tracked her as she entered. You came back, he said quietly. She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. She just checked his vitals, verified his chest tube drainage, noted his oxygen saturation, 97%, perfect, and stepped back. Rest, she said. Nothing more. She was leaving when Chen's hand reached out, grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, trembling from anesthesia and blood loss, but his eyes held absolute certainty. I know who you are. I've always known. The room contracted around her. The monitors seemed to amplify their beeping. She pulled her hand back gently and walked out without speaking, her heart moving like a creature trying to escape her chest. By 10:44 a.m., Hargrove had called an emergency meeting with the department heads. He walked through the scenario as though presenting a case study, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. We have a protocol violation. A nurse performed an advanced cardiac intervention without proper credentialing. While the patient survived, we cannot allow this behavior to continue. We're initiating a full audit of her background, her qualifications, and her scope of practice over the past 2 decades. Until this investigation is complete, she's suspended pending review. The chief medical officer frowned. Hargrove, this seems precipitous. The patient is recovering perfectly. The procedure was, which makes it worse, Hargrove interrupted. If she can perform like a cardiologist without formal training, how do we know she hasn't been misrepresenting her qualifications all along? This is a credentialing issue. It's institutional. We move now or we're complicit. The words hung in the air like poison. Complicit. Liable. Exposed. One by one, the department heads nodded their agreement. Brooke's hands were steady when she restocked the supply cart at 11:27 a.m. Her breathing was controlled. She'd been trained for this, compartmentalize and under pressure. But something had shifted in the architecture of her world. Chen's recognition meant the past wasn't buried. It was awake. It was walking the halls of Oak Creek Memorial in a hospital gown, connected to machines, slowly rebuilding itself into existence. She was loading gauze packages into slots on the cart when she heard her name over the overhead speaker. Brooke Sullivan to administration. Brooke Sullivan to administration. Not a page. A summons. Her fingers paused on the gauze package. Around her, other nurses glanced sideways. That tone meant something official. Something formal. She finished loading the cart, set it aside with precision, and walked toward administration as though walking toward any other task. Her composure was a mask, but it was a mask she'd worn for 20 years. The security officer was waiting outside the administrator's office. 2 of them, actually. Their badges said Oak Creek Memorial Security. Their expressions said they'd done this before. Ms. Sullivan, we need to escort you to your locker. Hospital policy requires we document the retrieval of personal items. Her mouth went dry but her voice remained steady. What's this about? The first officer, nameplate reading Rodriguez, handed her a letter. Termination notice. Effective immediately, your employment with Oak Creek Memorial has been suspended pending investigation of credential discrepancies and scope of practice violations. You're being escorted from the premises. You may collect personal items from your locker. Your employee badge is deactivated as of right now. She took the letter. Her hands didn't shake. The words seemed to come from very far away, as though addressed to someone else. How long is this investigation? Rodriguez shook his head. That's above my pay grade. Just come with us, please. The walk to the locker room took 47 seconds. She counted them. The hallways seemed to narrow as they moved through them. Nurses stopped talking. Doctors lowered their phones. The entire institution was watching her walk out, surrounded by security, her identity peeling away like paint from old wood. Her locker was 347, she'd had it for 19 years and 8 months. She opened it slowly. Her stethoscope hung on the hook where it always hung. A photo of Ethan at 14, grinning, wearing his soccer uniform. And at the very bottom, hidden behind her extra scrubs, the pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan, scuffed leather, the soles worn thin from 1,000 miles of running. She'd hidden them there because she couldn't throw them away and couldn't display them. They were evidence of a life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She pulled down the box Rodriguez handed her and started placing items inside. The stethoscope first. The photo. She hesitated on the boots, then placed them carefully in the box, soles down, leather weathered to the color of old whiskey. Rodriguez watched. His expression had shifted slightly, not sympathy exactly, but recognition of something. He'd seen plenty of terminations, but something about this one felt heavier than institutional protocol. 14 minutes later, the box was full. Her badge was deactivated with a soft beep. The magnetic lock on the locker clicked shut permanently. She was asked to sign a document confirming receipt of the termination notice. She signed it in handwriting she barely recognized as her own. Then they walked her to the exit. Dr. Hargrove watched from the third-floor window of his office. Coffee still warm in his hand. Brooke Sullivan walking out between 2 security officers, carrying a single cardboard box. Her shoulders were level. Her head was up. She didn't look defeated, but she looked like someone who'd just lost everything. Hargrove smiled into his coffee and took a slow, satisfying sip. That night, Savannah's Laurel Grove Cemetery was empty except for rain. Rain that fell in sheets, in waves, in a relentless percussion against the ground and the granite markers. Brooke knelt in front of the headstone at 11:44 p.m., the cardboard box placed carefully beside her in the mud. The stone read, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Sullivan, United States Navy SEAL, beloved husband and father, 1978 to 2015. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered. Her voice wasn't steady anymore. The composure had finally broken. I failed. I couldn't even save myself this time. Rain poured down her face. She wasn't sure where the rain ended and the tears began. The boots were beside her in the box. She pulled one out and held it like it was still warm from his feet, like the leather still carried his shape. You died keeping these secrets. You died protecting what we couldn't talk about. And I promised I would survive it. I promised I would be strong enough. But I wasn't. Lightning cracked across the sky, and for a moment the entire cemetery was illuminated, the headstones like teeth, the rain like static, and Brooke Sullivan on her knees in the mud, 20 years of silence finally breaking like a dam. Her phone buzzed. 17 missed calls from Ethan. She ignored them all. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry. She knelt there until the rain stopped, until her body had nothing left to give, until the storm inside her matched the storm in the sky, and finally, slowly, they found a kind of equilibrium. In the hospital 12 blocks away, in room for 12, Staff Sergeant Chen lay awake in the darkness, his monitor showing steady rhythm, his hand on his phone, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to a teenager he'd never met. Your mom needs you now. Listen carefully. There's a shadow box in her closet, top shelf, behind the winter coats. It has everything. All of it. You need to bring it to the hospital tomorrow morning. Bring everything. And listen to me, you don't understand what your mother is. But tomorrow, you're going to find out. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Brooke pushed open the door to the women's locker room, her personal belongings already boxed. Security stood at the threshold, not aggressive, just present, their presence a formal reminder that she'd become a liability instead of an asset. 20 years of arriving before dawn, staying past nightfall, holding the line when systems failed. 20 years, and it took 1 week for it to unravel. She reached for her locker combination, hand steady as surgical steel, when the main entrance doors burst open downstairs with enough force to rattle the overhead speakers. A voice cut through the lobby, young, urgent, filled with a kind of desperation only a teenager could summon. "Mom. Mom, they need to see these, all of it." "Ethan." Brooke's hand stopped moving. She didn't breathe. She didn't turn around. But down in the lobby, her 16-year-old son stood holding a shadow box with the kind of reverence usually reserved for reliquaries, his voice echoing off the tile and concrete like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The security officers exchanged glances. One of them moved toward the stairs. Brooke moved faster, muscle memory taking over, her body already in motion before her mind caught up. She descended the stairwell in controlled silence, each step precise. The lobby had gone quiet in that peculiar way hospitals do when something shifts the oxygen in the room. Nurses at the front desk had stopped processing charts. A resident froze mid-conversation. Ethan stood in the center of the atrium, 17-year-old shoulders back, holding a shadow box that glinted under the halogen lights. His eyes found hers across the distance, and something in his expression said, "I know what I'm doing." Beside him stood a man in dress blues, navy dress blues, the kind that cost $1,000 and only existed in ceremony or when the Pentagon decided something mattered. His shoulders carried the weight of command like others wore cologne. He was dark-haired, mid-40s, with eyes that had catalogued every entrance and exit in less than 6 seconds. A SEAL team leader, moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators that had already calculated trajectories before anyone else noticed the room had changed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. His voice came out like gravel under a tank. Not a request. A confirmation. "I'm Commander James Holloway, Naval Special Warfare Command." "That's your son?" Brooke stood 3 feet from her child, hyper-aware that every person in this lobby was now watching, now listening, now witnessing something that was about to shatter the careful fiction she'd maintained for 2 decades. She took one measured breath. Nodded once. Ethan stepped forward, holding the shadow box like it weighed more than bone and glass and metal. "Silver Star for Valor." Holloway's voice filled the silence as he pointed to each decoration. His finger moved with the precision of a man reading names at a memorial. Marja, 2004. Rescue Operation, 3 civilians extracted under mortar fire. You carried one of them 3 miles through a kill zone with a femoral artery wound that should have ended him in the first click. The night shift nurse at the desk, Sarah, had worked trauma for 16 years, gasped audibly. Her hand went to her mouth. Bronze Star with V device. Holloway continued, relentless. 2006, Kandahar Province. Bronze Star number 2, 2008. Sanjin Valley. He paused, let the weight settle. And a Purple Heart. 2 fragments from an IED, 2007. You kept working for 70 minutes before the pain was information you couldn't ignore anymore. Brooke's eyes remained forward. Composure absolute. But something underneath, something that had been buried so deep it became invisible, was being excavated in real time. And finally, Holloway's voice dropped, became almost reverent, a Navy Cross. Operation designation redacted. Location redacted. Date redacted. Your commanding officer's recommendation is sealed. The citation references extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty in conditions deemed unsuitable for survival. That's classified speak for you shouldn't have lived through it. But you did. The lobby was so quiet now that the ventilation system hummed like it was the only thing still breathing. A security guard's radio squawked somewhere distant. Nobody moved to answer it. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the personnel file still sitting open on her desk, the official record that had been closed to everyone for 20 years. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, she read aloud, voice shaking as she traced the redacted sections with one finger. 12 years active service. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. 3 tours. Classification sealed per JSOC Directive. Honorable Discharge, 2012. Subsequently employed civilian sector medical services. Security clearance, top secret SCI. The double doors to the administrative wing opened. 2 men in FBI windbreakers stepped through with the casual authority of people who didn't need permission to occupy space. Behind them came the hospital administrator, whose face had gone the color of old concrete. And behind all of them, coming to a dead stop, was Dr. Hargrove. His hand was still reaching for the elevator button. The senior FBI agent, late 50s, badge visible, voice carrying the flat certainty of federal authority, addressed the room but looked directly at Hargrove. Dr. Derek Hargrove. We have concluded our investigation into the termination of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. What we found was systematic fraud, federal record forgery, and obstruction related to sealed military documentation. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He stepped back, calculating, still thinking there was a way to control the narrative. There wasn't. You attempted to access DLIS, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency databases, using credentials that belong to a hospital board member you coerced. That's a federal crime. The FBI agent's voice never rose. You contracted with a document forger in Atlanta to create false credential reports. That's fraud and conspiracy. You filed false reports with the Georgia Medical Board claiming Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had undisclosed military training that violated nursing standards. That's fraud and defamation. Behind the agent, hospital security was already moving. Not to escort Brooke out anymore. To escort Hargrove. Additionally, the agent continued, security camera footage from this facility shows at least 6 deliberate physical assaults over a 7-day period. The cafeteria incident. The patient chart. 3 more incidents not immediately reported. That's assault and harassment with documented malice aforethought. Hargrove's face flushed, not rage, but panic. The kind of panic that comes when every exit gets sealed simultaneously. He looked toward his allies. The board members he'd called on. They weren't making eye contact. Patricia Owens, who sat on the hospital's finance committee, had already released a statement to legal saying she had no knowledge of his requests and would be consulting her own attorney. The external investigator from Atlanta had provided documentation proving Hargrove had fabricated the credential concerns before any investigation began. 3 residents had submitted formal complaints about his pattern of retaliation. A dozen nurses had come forward independently. His network hadn't collapsed. It had evaporated. The FBI agent gestured toward the exit. Handcuffs were already being prepared. Hargrove moved, not toward the doors, but toward Brooke. One last play. One last attempt to dominate the narrative, to be the one doing the dismissing instead of being dismissed. He made eye contact. She gave him one measured breath and the slightest nod, the kind of nod a superior officer gives a subordinate who's failed inspection. Her composure was absolute. Untouchable. It was the exact opposite of what he'd been trying to break. His shoulders sagged. He turned toward the exit. The handcuffs closed with the distinctive click of federal authority. He walked past the whiteboard where someone had written Sullivan exit pool, 7 days in dry erase marker. Past the nurse's station where every person had stopped working to watch. Past Ethan, who was still holding the shadow box like it was the most important thing in the world. Past Brooke Sullivan, who stood in the center of her own resurrection with the absolute stillness of someone who had already survived worse than this. The doors closed behind him. The lobby remained silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the administrator extended his hand toward Brooke with an expression that combined contrition and bureaucratic necessity. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Oak Creek Memorial would like to offer you immediate reinstatement. Full restoration of status. Director of Emergency Medicine, effective immediately. Plus a formal apology from the board. Brooke shook his hand once. Released it. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Holloway stepped forward, produced an envelope with a presidential seal embossed in the corner. His voice carried the weight of official sanction. There's something else you need to know, Senior Chief. Staff Sergeant James Chen is receiving the Medal of Honor for his actions in 2004. He requested that you be present at the ceremony. Brooke's eyes went to the photograph in the corner of the envelope. An 8-year-old boy with frightened eyes. A woman in combat boots, carrying him through smoke and sand, an operation that officially never happened. Her operation. Her rescue. Her secret, finally declassified. The ceremony is in 2 days, Holloway said. The Pentagon sending a chopper. You're going to wear your dress blues for the first time since discharge. Around them, the lobby began to move again. Nurses returned to their work. The resident restarted his interrupted conversation. But everyone now knew who Brooke Sullivan actually was. What she'd actually done. What she'd actually survived. Ethan moved toward her, still holding the shadow box. They didn't embrace. Not in public. Instead, she placed one hand on his shoulder, the way officers do with soldiers, and whispered low enough that only he could hear, "You remembered. All these years, you remembered." "I need some jello," she said to no one in particular, and for the first time in a week, someone laughed. 6 months later, Brooke drove through Savannah with her newly restored director's badge hanging from her rearview mirror. She passed a strip mall on Victory Drive where a folding table sat outside a cut-rate insurance office. Dr. Derek Hargrove sat behind it in a polo shirt, his medical license permanently revoked, facing federal fraud charges that the prosecutor had described as exceptionally strong. His eyes tracked her car as it passed. He looked away first. At Oak Creek Memorial, her new office displayed the shadow box on one wall, medals finally visible after 20 years of silence. The photograph from the envelope sat framed beside it, her younger self carrying Chen through fire, the secret no longer crushing, the truth no longer buried. Chen visited weekly now, his Medal of Honor ceremony having revealed the mission they'd both been ordered to forget, the secrecy finally lifted after 2 decades. Ethan wore his father's seal trident pin to school, the weight of hidden identity no longer crushing his shoulders. The combat boots rested on her bookshelf, no longer hidden in a locker, their scars honored rather than concealed. A new nurse approached her office hesitantly. "Director Sullivan, there's a situation in the ER. A doctor's order doesn't seem right, but I'm afraid to say anything." Brooke stood, placed a hand on the nurse's shoulder, "Then we say something. Together." As they walked toward the emergency department, she glanced at her reflection in the window, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, finally allowed to exist in daylight. That evening, she returned to Laurel Grove Cemetery, kneeled at Marcus's headstone, but this time the sun was setting golden through the trees. She placed a photo against the granite, her and Chen at the White House, both in dress uniform, both alive, both finally acknowledged. "You taught me something I finally understand," she whispered. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." She stood, walked back to her car, and drove toward home, toward Ethan, toward the hospital that had almost destroyed her, toward a future that was finally, after 2 decades of silence, her own. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.